Let's begin to add color. Whether it's the owl drawing or a different drawing, if you were offered options, the process we're going to follow is going to be the same. First, with an eraser, I'm erasing any pencil lines that I might still have that are stray marks that I want to get rid of. Because once I paint, it won't be so easy to get rid of them. Then I'm going to paint. This is relatively newer watercolor paint and it works really well, but I want to talk about the basics and tips for success. I also have a relatively newer watercolor brush, and as a reminder, we only ever want to use the very tip of the brush. When we're watercolor painting, you actually need a lot less paint than you might think, because in watercolor, one of the main ingredients is water. So I've got my water cup, it's halfway full so it's less likely to tip. And then I've got my paint palette, which has this mixing well. One of the things we want to make sure we're doing is always leaving the paint open. At the end of class, you might still have colors that are left over in the mixing well, and if we closed it, they could drip down in and mix up the paints for everyone else. So whenever we're mixing colors, we want to mix only in the lid and wash our brush before we go back to one of the oval paints. I'm going to start with the stump. In this palette, I have some brown paint right here. So I'm actually going to take some water, gently swirl in the brown paint, and it's on my brush. But watercolor paint looks best when it's mixed with some water. So I'm going to take the brown, mix some in the lid, and then I can begin to paint with it. We do want to sort of see the paper coming through to get its translucent effects. And watercolor will usually work best when we paint in long, smooth strokes. That's why it can be really helpful to mix some of your color with water in the lid first, so that you can go back to it instead of having to remix it each time. You can end up with a smoother look. Now I don't have quite enough to finish the stump here, so I'm going to put a couple more drops of water into the lid really carefully, put a little more paint in there, mix, and then I can continue to paint. One of the great things about watercolor is you can always make an area darker by adding more layers on top after it's dried. That's a watercolor technique called glazing. So if you're noticing your color is more pale than you want, you can always change that later after the paint's dry. If you make it too dark, it's a lot harder to change it. So I recommend painting more light than you think you need to. Once I've got one color done, then I can think about what else I want to do in my picture. For me, on the snowy owl, I'm going to paint the eyes next, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see some detail. I have some yellow paint on my brush, and because this area is so small, I want to go extra slowly so I can be careful. I'm also making sure I'm always pulling the brush in one direction. That way I'm not going to destroy the brush for anyone else. We want to keep this nice sharp tip on our brush. That way lots of people can use it. And it'll last for a long time. I find that the slower I go, the more control I have. Also for small areas like this, I like to hold on the metal ferrule instead of the grip. That's something that I find to be helpful. You can experiment with strategies that you think are helpful in this process. Now something that I'm doing, whenever I go to a different color in my paints, I'm always washing my brush in the water first, because I wanted to add some of this yellow-orange to the beak here, and maybe a little bit to the inside of the eyes also. But before I did that, I put my brush and I swished it in the water. That way I won't put the light yellow in the dark yellow and mix up the paint for everyone else who's using it. So if I want a new color, I'm going to take my brush, swish it in the water, and then I can go to a new color. Maybe, for example, I want to use a blue color to add some shadows to the wings. I want a light blue, so I can do that by putting the blue in here, and then I can sort of begin to see what color it looks like. Because I had a lot of water in my brush, it's already pretty light blue. Maybe if it's really green and I want it to be a bit of a different blue, I can get another color and mix it in the lid. That's a nice shadow color, I think, so I'm going to add just some shadows right underneath here. It might be very faint. Maybe I'll add just a little more color to my mix. If you're watercolor is ever too much water and you're worried about it dripping somewhere else, a quick tip is to use a paper towel or a tissue, and I'm going to fold it into a pointy shape and just soak up some of that water. This might spread or smear your colors too though, so we can practice carefully and be okay with the fact that things might change over time. I kind of like that little shadow look. I'm going to add some shadows for these other feathers too. And that'll add just a little bit of color even though my owl is a snowy owl. Your owl doesn't have to be a snowy owl. Maybe you want to paint the wings and the body brown and make it like a bald eagle. That'd be a fun idea to experiment with. And it's your artwork, so you can choose how it's going to look. Alright, so I've got some color on the wings here. Maybe I'll add just a little shadows on the head too. The slower you go, the more careful you can be. I think I started rushing and then I started making some mistakes. But it's pretty light, so that's another reason to paint in light watercolor layers, is if you do make a mistake, it won't be as visible. Something that's really cool about the watercolor paint is after I've cleaned my brush with water, I could even use paint mixes that someone else has made before. Maybe I'm going to use this nice orange color to paint in the talons. Alright, I like how that's looking. The last thing I need to paint is the background, and so I want to think about maybe using different colors to make my owl stand out. Another reason to use enough water on your paintbrush is to make sure that your colors are blending. If your paintbrush is really dry, I find that it looks streaky and then it's hard to blend the colors together to make it look good. So I like to always dip my brush in the water right before I get even more of the same color. That way I'll have a mix of water and paint on my brush. I chose to do sort of a sunset background, so I'm using the colors in the order they are in the palette, which is also the color wheel order. So I started with yellow, then I went to yellow-orange, then orange, then red-orange. Now I'm painting with red, and then I'll finish with red-violet. I think these colors sort of contrast the owl and the stump and make it look very bright and vivid. But again, you can paint with whatever colors you want because it's your artwork. I'm really excited to see your owls as you begin to paint them today, or if you're painting something else, whatever colors you pick. You can still paint carefully with the paints, even if it's a different picture.